So I was asked to talk about the social sort of consequences, the socioeconomic responses of some of these changes, and I think what I've put up here is exactly what Tim and John are saying. It basically, the ongoing transformation of the Arctic is going to have major economic, health, geopolitical, and social consequences, and that's a lot of what I focus on in my work. And I think as Canadians living, most of us living in the South, I'm guessing none of you are living in Nunavut or Northwest Territories right now, we don't understand it. We don't realize that half of our nation is the Arctic. We are an Arctic country, and this is happening in our front yard every day. And the consequences are enormous. So, we can't cover them all. So I'm gonna try to cherry pick a few of these just with some pretty pictures. The first thing that I think about is with climate change and reduction of sea ice, there's increased access to natural resources in the Arctic. And of course, the Arctic is a very, very fragile place. There's low biodiversity. The consequences of a spill in the Arctic are hundreds to thousands of times higher than the consequences of a spill in other places. On top of that, we don't have infrastructure in place, as Tim noted, to deal with these things. So when we think about risk, the risk in the Arctic is enormous. So this is one thing that's going on, and we're seeing Arctic nations exploit this every day, in particular Russia and Greenland, and other non-Arctic nations have extreme interest in exploiting these resources as well, especially in areas that are not claimed by certain nations. So there's a lot of conflict. We could see a lot of conflict in the future over this. We're seeing the expansion and the production of new fisheries, opportunities for new fisheries, and we're seeing some small fisheries development in the Canadian Arctic. So the investment in the Pangertung Harbor is a really good example. So some of these changes could be good, but only if we take them seriously, and only if we have policies in place that allow us to mitigate risk and take advantage of opportunities, but opportunities that benefit the people that live in the region and not just our nation as a whole. Growing tourism. So this is a big one. People don't think about tourism that much unless you're going to the Caribbean to drink margaritas by the pool. Tourism in the Arctic is huge. It's the fastest growing maritime activity in the Canadian Arctic right now. So we've seen a 400% increase in yachts going through the Northwest Passage in the last 5 years alone. And you can imagine that yachts do not have double steel hulls. We saw, 2 years ago, we had a yacht sink in the Arctic. We have groundings of cruise ships every year. It is a matter of time before we see some sort of major disaster in the tourism industry in the Arctic. And that is why the Canadian military and other and Coast Guard are always doing drills on a cruise ship disaster in the Arctic. And the other thing is these ships, these cruise ships, they like to go off the corridors. They like to go into the places where the ice has melted, where they think no one has been before. That's the adventure. So that makes them even more of a risk. And the big thing, this is what I focus on because I find it absolutely fascinating, but we're going to likely see increased transpolar traffic or shipping through the Arctic. Certainly through the Russian Arctic, through the Northern Sea Route, we're already seeing that. But through the Northwest Passage, we expect that by 2050, even non-ice strengthened vessels will be able to reliably go through the Northwest Passage for transpolar shipping. So right now, most trade goes through the south, through the Suez and Panama Canal. But the route through the Arctic has been sought after for hundreds of years. That's why we have the Franklin, the whole Franklin story. We've been wanting to access this route for centuries, and now it is becoming a reality. And as Canadians, we have a really important role to play in the future. And we have a debatable conflict over the Northwest Passage, whether it's inland waters or whether it's in international strait. Of course, it's inland waters, but not all nations recognize that. So we are going to see issues. Now, something I don't think people understand, people think reduction in sea ice equals smooth sailing in the Arctic, clear seas, open pathways. And it is not the reality. And that's why we see crazy people in yachts going up trying to go through the Northwest Passage. The reality is it's more dangerous now to sail the Northwest Passage, to ship through the Northwest Passage than it ever was before. And the reason is that the ice used to be big and impassable. And now that ice is broken up into small bergy bits and icebergs, and it's the prevailing winds and ocean currents are flowing those icebergs into the Canadian Arctic archipelago and into the Northwest Passage, which creates a way more dangerous situation than we had before. So you've got this conflict between people thinking the Arctic is open, I'm going to go with my super yacht, and it's actually way more dangerous to navigate than before. So we've already seen a tripling of traffic, of ship traffic in the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic in the last few years, and I think we will see a heck of a lot more in the future. Changing geopolitics. So I mentioned the sovereignty dispute that we have in the Northwest Passage. China came out with a white paper, I guess it was a year ago, over a year ago now, where they explicitly state right in the white paper that we fully intend to exploit the Northwest Passage, and they call it the Polar Silk Road. And unexplicitly, they dispute Canada's claim over that Polar Silk Road. So this is coming. This is coming. You know, people debate this about when it's coming. It is coming. And how we deal with that is really important. And thus far, I commend the Canadian government for how we've dealt with it. And the Chinese icebreaker, Snow Dragon, that went through last year followed all of the rules that we requested based on our Canadian Shipping Act. So far, so good. But I do anticipate that in the future we will see challenges and conflict. The other thing I think people don't realize is that 90% of everything in this room, 90% of everything you purchased today, yesterday, 90% of the clothes that you're wearing move in this world by ship. Ships are the cornerstone, the backbone of our entire economy. It's the reason we have modern society and civilization as we know it. It's why you get deals at Canadian Tire in that awesome flyer that they put in my mailbox every week. It's because these things come by ship. Otherwise, things would be incredibly expensive. If those ships start going through the Arctic on a regular basis instead of through the south, then we will have major implications, not only environmentally for the people of the Arctic, but also geopolitically, and we will have changing power dynamics between nations. And I can't remember the exact figure, I just thought of it, but if you just look at the Arctic GDP, just Arctic, I think Canada represents about 1.2%, and Russia is 78%. So we will see changing power dynamics if we see trade predominantly through the Arctic. It's 100 years away, but if we do, then we need to be preparing for what that might look like. And then the last point, which is potentially the most important, is that this has major impacts on the lives of Northerners. Something like just under 70% of Nunavut households are already food insecure. And access to country foods, beluga, narwhal, they're going to be majorly impacted, and that's going to impact food security again. The only saving grace might be that we will have more opportunity for maritime resupply to improve food security, but 90% of communities in Nunavut, they're still only going to get resupply once, twice a year, even with an increasing shipping season. So we are going to have major challenges in the north. And I'll leave it there because then we have more time for questions.